In this lesson, we're finally going to get to the meat of the start of this course on revolution and dictatorship, looking at the first of these revolutions, which is, of course, the February Revolution. We're going to divide our understanding of the February Revolution into 3 lessons. And the reason for this is I want to spend some time thinking about the broader contours of the February Revolution in this lesson. The next lesson is going to be a very fact-based, quite dreary, quite dry, quite descriptive analysis of the course of the February Revolution, what happened and when. And then the final lesson on the February Revolution will look at the abdication of the Tsar. Some of the key details associated with that, before we then start moving on to thinking about the period in between the revolutions, the provisional governments, the nature of dual power with the Petrograd Soviet, the return and the ideology of Lenin, the Kornilov coup, and all these different kinds of things. So that's going to be the sort of structure of the next few videos on this topic. So what were the main causes of the February Revolution? Long-term causes. And I've put here long-term political failures, but you could also include structural failures. Failures within the state itself. The first point that I should raise is this fact that ultimately the system of governance that the revolution seeks to overthrow is one of autocratic rigidity. It was marked by a deeply entrenched autocracy, a failure to modernize politically and to maintain absolute rule, even with and even as the socio-economic conditions of the Russian people begin to worsen, starts to foster a deeper sense of alienation among Russian citizens. Nicholas II himself was a particularly detached politician from broader society, let's just say. He rejected any dilution of his power. He dissolved the Duma in 1915. And really, I don't think we mentioned it in too much detail, but if you want to go and have a look at the module for paper 1 on Tsarist and Communist Russia that sort of takes you a little bit further back in the history, you might be inclined to spend a little bit of time thinking about the 1905 revolution and the October Manifesto, because that provides a perfect illustration of the detachment that Nicholas had and his entrenched autocracy. The fact that there was a revolution to overthrow the Tsar, essentially, a revolution to bring about major political reforms, and Nicholas opted instead for a policy of appeasement, really. The October Manifesto and the creation of the State Duma was as a way to try and appease the population, to neutralize the population in order to maintain a tight grip over power and control. Again, he starts to alienate the population through the worsening of socioeconomic conditions. His taking control of the military in 1915 essentially associates him with every single military failure. And then in 1915 as well, he dissolves the Duma, which further alienates both the liberal and the reformist elements within that structure. Workers are beginning to endure harsh conditions. They have to deal with low wages, they have to deal with long hours, they have to deal with very little recourse, but to unionize under an oppressive environment. We can start to see as well that peasants are beginning to suffer too. They are subjugated by their landowners, they are burdened by the outdated agricultural methods, and as we've mentioned earlier on in previous lessons when we looked at society and the economy, they are starting to become devastated by the disruptions associated with the war and the major disruptions with having to fight a war and trying to maintain some kind of semblance of society. Further to this, we have to think about the economic strain. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. We spent a whole lesson looking at it. Food shortages and inflation were the sort of immediate sort of spark, the immediate catalyst of the February Revolution. In Petrograd, between 1913 and 1916, flour prices nearly doubled. Meat more than doubled. Salt prices exploded by nearly 500%. There are also the calamitous military failures, of course. He was not a particularly good wartime leader. The desertion rates would increase. There were little flickers of positivity in terms of the war effort, the Brusilov offensive, for example, but for the most part, it was defeat after defeat after defeat and major setbacks for the Russian military. And so when we think about the revolution itself, bringing us all the way to the point at which the revolution begins, the first point I want to make very clear is in the previous lesson, I made a note that the female textile workers began to protest the meat and bread shortages on the 8th of March 1917. Now, this isn't actually incorrect. It just depends on which calendar you use. And this is a bit of a confusion that just adds some complexity to your studies, unfortunately. But there are two calendars. You have a Julian calendar, you have the Gregorian calendar. For the most part, when we think about the February Revolution, it's called the February Revolution because according to the Julian calendar, most of the events of the February Revolution take place in February. So the 8th of March protests in Petrograd is actually the 23rd of February if we think about the Julian calendar. For the most part, I will give you both the dates just to avoid any kind of confusion. But for your own peace of mind, just pick one of the Julian or Gregorian calendars. Okay, probably go with Julian, and then just stick with it and keep it as it is. That's just a piece of advice because it can get confusing, and sometimes, depending on the sources you read, these lessons are derived from a variety of different, a few different textbooks, a couple of actual normal historical books, as well as some online websites. They use different calendars, so I'll bear in mind for future reference for the next few lessons. So fundamentally, then, I want to begin by thinking about the food riots. On International Women's Day on the 23rd of February 1917, there is the protests, the march against meat and bread shortages, the demands for food attached to broader political grievances. A few days prior to this as well, there was a mill strike in Putlov on the 18th of February, where workers at Putlov launched a strike over wages amid rising prices. This had then snowballed in Putlov within a few days to the point at which there were over 200,000 workers on strike. So fundamentally, there are sort of multiple different strikes and mutinies and revolts that are taking place all across the country. Historians mostly come to the conclusion that the 23rd of February, the Women's March on Petrograd, is the sort of catalyst for the February Revolution. But there were escalations taking place a little bit earlier on, but it all sort of culminates in the 23rd of February to the point at which there are major strikes going across and snowballing throughout the country. There is then a military mutiny on the 2nd of March on the Julian calendar, with the regime unraveling completely, and urged by the Duma, Nicholas II abdicates, ending the Romanov dynasty then and there. Like I said at the start of this lesson, the next video is going to focus on the course of the February Revolution. It's going to be a very descriptive overview. Essentially, it's just the snowballing of revolution that results in the abdication of the Tsar. The more important parts of this series on this first chapter are going to be concerning the lessons after that, when we talk about the nature of the provisional government, the Petrograd Soviet, the idea of dual power, and the major missteps and mishaps that the provisional government and specifically the provisional government does that ultimately leads to another revolution in October, this one being the Bolshevik Revolution and consolidation of Bolshevik authority.